Welcome to the cell transport presentation. In this presentation, you will learn how the cell membrane controls the movement of substances into and out of the cell. We'll talk about osmosis, which is the movement of water. We'll also talk about diffusion. We'll talk about forms of active transport as well. The cell membrane is also called the plasma membrane. It's the thin and flexible layer around all cells. It has two main functions. The first function is protection. It's going to protect the cell from things that are outside of it. The next function is regulation. It's going to control what can enter and exit the cell. That's what we're going to focus on during this unit. The cell membrane is selective, so it allows some things to pass through more easily than it allows other things to pass through. It's also semi-permeable. Permeate is a fancy way to say pass through. So being semi-permeable means that some things can go through and some things cannot. We describe the cell membrane as following the fluid mosaic model. First of all, what does it mean to be fluid? Think about this in terms of movement. Pause this video and brainstorm a few things that you think of when you hear the word fluid. Write them on your notes. Now I want you to think about beach balls floating on water. The components of the cell membrane, like the lipids, are always in motion and they can slide past each other. This allows other molecules, and I have a typo here. I said like proteins, but it really should say like water or maybe like oxygen. This allows these other molecules to slide in between the components of the cell membrane and into or out of the cell. So, in other words, the cell membrane is not this rigid structure with immovable components. It's fluid-like, it's flexible. And within the membrane, molecules can move around. Here's a picture of the cell membrane. Take a look at the carbohydrate chains. The cell's going to use those for communication. Take a look at the proteins that hold the carbohydrates. Take a look at the other types of proteins, the protein channels, and then take a look at the phospholipid bilayer. The cell membrane can also be called the lipid bilayer. The lipids in the cell membrane are special lipids called phospholipids. These phospholipids are going to make up the majority of the cell membrane. The phospholipids have two parts. They have a hydrophilic head. Hydrophilic means that the head likes water. Okay, the philic part means to like. So these hydrophilic heads like water. And another way that we can describe that is by saying that they are polar. These hydrophilic polar heads are made of phosphates. That is where the phospho part of the phospholipid bilayer comes from. The other part of the phospholipids are hydrophobic tails. You know what it means to have a phobia. You're afraid of something. Well, these hydrophobic tails don't like water, hence the part of the word phobic in the name. Another way to describe that is by calling it nonpolar. These hydrophobic nonpolar tails are made of fatty acids or lipids. These phospholipids are arranged in a special way. In order to protect the hydrophobic tails from water, they form a bilayer which keeps the hydrophobic tails inside of the cell membrane and the water-loving heads outside. let's talk about the other parts of the cell membrane. So we talked about the phospholipids, but there are also proteins and carbohydrate chains in the cell membrane. Protein molecules are going to bring materials into the cell, so they can either form a channel or a pump, and they will help to receive signaling from outside the cell. The carbohydrate molecules are super cool. They're actually the way that the cells communicate with each other. They will talk to each other using the carbohydrate chains. So let's take a little break from the cell membrane and talk about the other piece of cell transport, and that is a solution. So cells are within solutions. They are in an aqueous or water-based environment inside of the living thing that they are in. Solutions have two different parts. The first part of a solution is the solute. The solute are the molecules that are going to be dissolved inside of the liquid part of the solution. The liquid or the fluid that is dissolving the solute will be called the solvent. This makes up a solution. So, in a salt solution, what would be the solute and what would be the solvent? Take a moment, pause this video, and try to answer those questions. In a salt solution, the salt would be the solute and the water would be the solvent. Another important concept to understand when we talk about cell transport is the concept of concentration and the concept of equilibrium. Solutions will spread out their dissolved molecules or their solute until the solute is equal throughout the solution. At equilibrium, the molecules are going to be spread equally. So every part of the solution is going to have the same number of molecules. You hear the word equal in equilibrium. It's equally spread out. Concentration is where we count the number of molecules in a particular part of a solution or of the air. Okay, so when we talk about concentration, we can have a high concentration, which is like this picture on the left. Lots of people crammed into a very small space. Okay, so that would mean lots and lots of molecules or solutes spread up, jammed into a small space. There's also you can also have a low concentration. If you look at the picture on the right, you'll see that there are not many people in the picture. So in a concentration, we have fewer solutes per unit volume. High concentration, more solute. Low concentration, less solute. So what happens when we put a membrane and we want to think about how things are going to move across the membrane? Well, if the inside of the cell is at the same concentration as the solution on the outside of the cell, then we would say that the cell is at equilibrium. At equilibrium, the solute and the solvent are going to move back and forth across the cell membrane. At equilibrium, there's always movement. Molecules are so excited, they're always moving around. So one thing that students always think is that at equilibrium, the solute and the solvent are still. That's not the case. They still have a lot of energy. They're still moving around. So at equilibrium, the solute and solvent are still moving back and forth across the cell membrane. So there are two different ways that things will move across the cell membrane. The first way is passive transport. This is moving across the cell membrane without using any energy at all. There's also active transport. This is movement across the cell membrane that will require energy, okay? And we can compare it to these two pictures on the right. At the top is a highway like what we have in Cincinnati. Cars can move freely about the highway without having to stop and pay. In other states like Illinois and New York, there are these things called tolls. So as cars move along the highway, they have to pay to actually get through the toll area. And that helps to provide revenue for the city. Well, transport of materials across the cell membrane is very similar. And passive transport is very much like how our highways are here in Cincinnati. We don't have to give any money or any energy to go down the highway. But active transport is just like those highways in really big cities where you have to pay or use energy, because energy is the cell's money, essentially. You have to pay to get across the toll portion of the highway. Now we're going to talk about the different types of passive transport. The first type we're going to talk about is diffusion. Solutes are going to move across the membrane from areas of a high concentration, where they're very crowded, to an area of low concentration. Diffusion uses random particle movements, so it doesn't use any energy at all. Okay? And if you look at the two pictures on the bottom, what you will see is that in the first picture, there's a high concentration inside the cell because there are lots of dots, and there is a lower concentration outside the cell. The dots are more spread apart. So diffusion is going to happen. Those things inside the cell are going to move out until they reach an equal concentration. Okay? And at equilibrium, remember that things are going to move back and forth across the cell membrane at an equal rate. This is just a picture that shows the movement of water across the cell membrane. The third type of passive transport is facilitated diffusion. In facilitated diffusion, large molecules or things that are charged negatively or positively will need the help of a protein to pass across a cell membrane. The proteins will form a channel, and the molecules are going to move through that channel or that doorway. Each channel is specific to a certain type of molecule. And this actually doesn't require any energy. That's why it's part of passive transport. If you look to the right, you will see that there's a couple different types of protein channels that can be made. There's one that stays open all the time. That one is up on the top. And then the one on the bottom is a certain type of channel that stays closed on one side and open on the other. And then when the molecule binds to part of the channel, then the back end will open and allow the molecule into or out of the cell. This is a GIF that's supposed to show supposed to show the channel that opens and closes. I'm not sure if it's going to work in this video, so if it doesn't, I'll show you in class. Alright, so we've talked about passive transport and things that don't require energy, but let's talk about active transport. In active transport, things are going to move against the concentration gradient. So let's break that down for a moment. In active transport, molecules are going to move away that they don't want to go. Okay? Molecules are like students. They don't want to be crowded into one area. Okay, so if there's already a high concentration of molecules, they're going to try to spread out to where there are fewer molecules. In active transport, we have to push molecules from areas where they're already spread out to areas where they're jam-packed, and they don't want to go that way. So this is going to require energy. So again, active transport will move molecules against their concentration gradient from a low concentration to a high concentration. Okay. The part that I forgot to mention, and so I'll stick it in here, is that the difference in solute concentrations is called a concentration gradient. And I'll show you more about that in class. The first type is a pump. A protein pump, is going to push molecules across the cell membrane. And remember, it's pushing them in the way that they don't want to go. Okay? So if you look at the picture to the left, it's going to push the molecules at the top in the blue area down to the molecules in the yellow area. The molecules don't want to go that way, so the cell has to use energy to push them. One example of this is the sodium and potassium pump, and I will show you an example in class. The second type of active transport is called endocytosis. You hear in the word? Yep, that means things are coming into the cell. This is actually the way that some unicellular organisms eat. They eat by endocytosis. So endocytosis is where a piece of the cell membrane makes a vacuole around molecules that are outside of the cell and pinches off inward to release the material inside of the cell. It's pretty cool, actually. There are different types of endocytosis. You'll not be quizzed or tested on any of these, but phagocytosis is what I mentioned before, how some unicellular organisms will eat. The third type is exocytosis. Ex, like your ex-boyfriend or girlfriend, they are out, okay? Exocytosis means out of the cell. A vacuole inside the cell is going to fuse or bind to the cell membrane. It'll open up and force the material outside of the cell. Here are a couple of examples of exocytosis. Of course, I will not be quizzing you on these, but it's pretty cool to look at.